The Fake Baseball Podcast is proud to be brought to you by Underdog Fantasy. Underdog Fantasy is the easiest place to play fantasy sports and is also the fastest growing fantasy app in the industry. Underdog Fantasy is the best and easiest place to play fantasy sports. Underdog Fantasy lets you draft a fantasy team in minutes. Sign up with promo code FAKEBASEBALL to claim your special pick plus first-time deposit offer up to $250 in bonus cash. I love the pick'em games. It's so easy to just pick higher or lower on. I've been hammering home the higher on Luis Ariz hits. That just always seems to be pretty automatic. So go check that out. Use code FAKEBASEBALL over at Underdog. Fantasy must be 18 and over, 21 and over in select states, and present in the state where Underdog Fantasy operates. Terms apply. Concerned with your play, call 1-800-GAMBLER over at the www.ncpgambling.org. Arizona 1-800-NEXT-STEP. Or text next step to 53342. New York, call the 24/7 Hope line at 1-877-8-HOPE-NY or text HOPE-NY 467-369. What is up, everybody? It is the Fake Baseball Podcast, and as you can tell, it is still just Blake Meyer. Dylan is still busy, but that's okay. Family time is always important. But with me today is a very special guest, Mr. Jolly Olive himself. Jolly, how you doing today, my man?
I'm good. My team won a baseball game yesterday, which I haven't been able to say a lot this year. And they didn't play today, so they haven't lost in 2 days. So our vibes are pretty high. No, I'm good. Had a really good weekend. You know, kind of a crummy end to it over here in the Northeast, but excited to get in the swing of things this week.
Yeah, I've been trying to keep track of the Mets. I mean, from the fantasy perspective, I roster Pete Alonso, I roster Francisco Lindor. It's been an interesting year. And just to get right into it, I mean, we're just going to get right into the thick of it. I'm going to ask you about the Mets first. I know I put it the backwards in the show notes, but it's okay. So I'm very interested in Pete Alonso as a Mariners fan because we've been hearing for what feels like a year now from the Mariners side of things that we've been rumored to trade for Pete Alonso at the deadline. If you had to give it a percentage, what percent chance do you think there is that Pete Alonso is traded from the Mets at the deadline this year?
I'm right now I'm about 50-50. I think if you asked me before the season, I probably would have told you just straight up no. I didn't think that was in the cards. But considering how poorly the season's gone for the Mets, they're a team that is built to sell. A lot of one-year deals, a lot of expiring contracts, and this was kind of the doomsday button that they planned for themselves. Mm-hmm. In terms of Alonso, I think he's probably the best, blue chip trade piece that they have, considering his resume, considering what he's probably due for in free agency, considering that they weren't able to get the extension done, even though the number was pretty darn big. But the interesting thing with Pete is that the market for him, it's a little bit select. Like the Mariners are definitely they make the most sense in my brain because when you think of teams that are lacking first base production, they're on that list for sure. If the Tigers are in things, I think they could possibly be a candidate considering Spencer Torkelson has had a really tough year. The Cubs, if the Michael Busch experiment kind of fizzles out, they were always kind of a player there as well. But that's the thing. Like, if it's not going to be the Mariners, which I think in terms of the team that has the farm system to do it and the team that needs him the most, it really is the Mariners in my brain. If it's not them, I don't think it's going to happen. So in that vein, I say 50-50, but I also lean heavily towards Seattle in that 50 if it were to happen.
Yeah, I think from my side of things, I guess the Mariners side of things, from my point of view, it feels the same because Seattle gets such inconsistent production out of their first base spot. We all want Ty France to be like 2021 Ty France. He's just not that guy, even though he did the old I went to drive line this offseason trick, and it's turned into some cool pimp job home runs lately. You didn't really see that out of Ty France before. But he's not the Ty France of old. And Seattle has, like you said, they have the prospects to make it happen. I know Ryan Divish, the beat writer for the Mariners the other day, talked about the fact that Harry Ford is most likely gone at the trade deadline this year for potentially a first baseman because Seattle doesn't really have a need for Harry Ford. They got Cal Raleigh. Raleigh's likely going to get re-signed. They're trying to move Harry around. So, I mean, it wouldn't be the first time Seattle made a big trade with the Mets.
Right.
Hopefully this one works out better in our favor than the last one. But I'm actually just going to use that as a transition. Edwin Diaz, I have to ask you about him. I don't know if it's the mentals lately that are really getting with him. And now he's no longer, I shouldn't say no longer the closer. He's just not the closer at the moment for the Mets.
Right.
How long do you think until we see Diaz back as the closer for the Mets?
Yeah, I mean it's kind of the scary unknown right now. The Mets normally have someone they can trust back there in the bullpen. I thought the way that they handled the situation as of late was pretty poor. They removed him from the spot, kind of publicly said, we're gonna work him back in through middle relief and other low scale opportunities. He pitched
Mhm.
okay, and I think one or two of those, and then he was instantly reinserted into the closer role and blew a save against San Francisco, which it all felt too soon. It felt like kind of a disservice to him. And
Mhm.
when we talk about the 2024 Mets, we're talking about who's getting traded, who's not. Diaz is one of three guys that I consider pretty unmovable at this point. Between him, Lindor, and Nimmo, they're signed to these long contracts that were all pretty much signed after 2022. So for Diaz, I mean, the Mets don't really have a choice. I mean, he is the closer of the foreseeable future. They have a couple other guys that have clicked this year, but no one to the degree that Diaz was 2 years ago. And
Mhm.
you can blame it on it's his first time with the pitch clock. You can blame it on he missed a year and he's probably getting his velo back up and all that. But it's worrisome because this is exactly how he looked when the trade first transpired back in 2019. A lot of home runs. A power pitcher getting beat by power is a recipe for disaster late in games, and you just have to
Mhm.
hope that he can find the confidence in his slider, get it to zip off the plate a little bit more instead of dying out in the middle. And I don't know if 98 on the regular is still in the tank for him. He's been sitting 96, 97, which is admittedly very fast, but it's not Edwin
Mhm.
Diaz. So I'm curious to see where that lands. I think if the Mets continue to peter out and they have, a lower leverage second half of the season, Diaz can use that to kind of get his footing under him and, get back to himself for next year, which could be a more pivotal year.
Yeah, that's a great point because Diaz he has to be the closer for the Mets. I got to figure out where I was going with that. He has to be the closer for the Mets because there's like you can count on one hand the amount of people that are even in the same ballpark as him when it comes to
Right.
being the closer for a Major League Baseball team. And so I really hope the Mets do their due diligence with making sure that he is right back in that mental headspace because if you throw him to the Wolves again and it goes bad again, uh, that's really gonna I don't want to say the yips, but it's gonna be an issue. And moving on from that, Jesus Christ. Francisco Lindor is somebody again, I mentioned I've been covering him closely. He's been okay this year. He's had his moments. He started the year really, really slow, which isn't out of the norm for him. He has started slow a bit in years past. But he's really slowed down lately as well. He had a lot of hot stretches there in the middle. Still 7 home runs, six stolen bases on the season. Still put up 1.3 F4 as well, which is pretty nice. Uh, what do you think is going on with Lindor right now that is causing kind of these extended cold streaks that we don't typically see out of him?
Yeah, that's an interesting question because, like you said, he is a slow starter. He kind of always has been. Aside from 2022, I think every time the first 2 months of the year, he's around a 700 OPS or below that. I think most Mets fans are used to that. But the fact of the matter is that things have been clicking a little bit better when we moved him into the leadoff spot, but I think it's confidence issues, and I think that's kind of plaguing a lot of Mets right now. I think the losing is getting to the head of the team a little bit, and it's a tough spot to be in because there is no easy answer. Otherwise, I think we would know the answer at this point.
Mm-hmm.
For Lindor, it's not like he's creeping up on father time or anything like that. This is still going to be considered his prime years of his career, and last year the guy went 30-30. So I know there's been a lot of alarms being run about Francisco Lindor. He had the took third strike on the breaking ball yesterday, and everyone was up in arms about that. And I thought his explanation was fine. The guy
Yep.
threw 5 balls in a row, so he decided to take, and he threw him a strike. And what are you going to do? I just think that when it rains, it pours, and especially in New York, when it rains, it pours. So hopefully, with the team maybe turning around in the near future, he can be at the forefront of that. But I think it all comes to a head. It gets under a magnifying glass when you have a series
Mhm.
like you did in Cleveland. Cleveland sweeps the series, and Menace comes up with the big home run. It's very easy to spin narratives out of that. But for Lindor, he's probably the one I have more confidence in getting back to himself quicker rather than Edwin Diaz. I think Diaz is a larger issue for sure. One that definitely, is the same level of concern.
Yes. I mean, even looking at the game log, I was slightly off. He's picked it up a bit lately. He's just been kind of void of home run power as of late, which everybody kind of hoped he could have another 30-30 season because he did actually have a pretty under the radar 30-30 season last year. I don't think many people realize that he was one of, I think it was 3 or 4 guys that did go 30-30 last year. Everybody talks about Acuna. They talk about J-Rod. They talk about those guys. You don't really think of, Francisco Lindor as a 30-30 guy. He's not that far off from doing that. Like you mentioned, he is getting pretty unlucky. 222 BABIP isn't great, but still striking out under 17% of the time. He's doing a little bit of everything. It's just a matter of the confidence, like you said. Like that's got to come back for Lindor. But a guy that I don't necessarily have the confidence in, and I'm not sure how Mets feel about him, would be Brett Baty. Obviously, he's been splitting some playing time with Vientos lately, or even just getting pushed aside for Vientos. What is the outlook for a Brett Baty looking like for the rest of this year? Is he kind of just the bottom half of a platoon at this point?
Yeah, I mean, his story is one of developmental failure on the Mets' part, I think. I mean, if you're very in tune with the Mets farm system these days, every other day there's a story about a new pitching prospect who's balling out at one level of the league. And that's really cool to see. And I think that's part of a newer regime and newer pitch data and analytics coming into the system. And I think that guys like Brett Baty, unfortunately, weren't able to benefit from that as much. And we're seeing that play out in live time. I mean, this guy was a number 12 overall pick. There's a lot expected of him. He's playing a premium position. And the guy is having a really tough time catching up to major league pitching. And it's kind of been the same thing for 3 years. And with Brett, it's tough because when you watch him play, you can see how much his defense has improved. You can see the work that he put in to make that a stronger area of his game. But it doesn't matter if you can't hit. You can't have a defense on third baseman. That's the kind of position you can't really sacrifice offensive output out of. And it doesn't help that a guy like Mark Vientos, who maybe is limited defensively for sure, comes up and is an immediate spark plug for the team. So if I had to infer what I think will happen, is if the Mets do end up sellers at the deadline, I think it would be wise of them to trade someone like Pete Alonso, and that way you can play Vientos and Baty every day and really see what you have on your hands with these guys. Because it's clear that Vientos isn't going to be a natural third baseman, and it's clear that Brett Baty is going to need as many reps as possible before the Mets kind of push the button and give up on him. And it's getting to that point. This is kind of the year where, you got to start to prove it a little bit and find your spot. He did it for the first 15 games of the year, but it's a long season, man. That's less than 10% of the way. So if the Mets do rebound and they're not in a position to sell and they keep Alonso, I think that problem gets a little bit more difficult and it becomes, you play the hot hand and whoever deserves the spot more. But at this point, the guy has had basically a full season's worth of plate appearances over his career, and he's got a 609 OPS. There's not many ways you can spin that other than it's gone very, very poorly.
And that's got to be really frustrating too, because when you do have those top hitting prospects, you always have just these immense hopes for them, especially in a place like New York, where I feel like everything is kind of magnified. The spotlight is bigger in New York, so to have somebody like that come up, and I don't necessarily want to say fail, but to come up and underperform, and then get another shot, and then underperform again,
right?
It for me, it's very reminiscent to Jared Kelenic, former Mets prospect, my favorite Mariners player there for a little bit. September Kelenic will always be a legend. But it's kind of the same thing. He never he got and didn't get a real chance in Seattle. Every time like he was going to get a real legitimate chance, they found a reason to platoon him. They sign an AJ Pollock. They do all these other things to kind of like you can have a shot, but you got somebody waiting in the wings immediately.
With strings attached.
And so, like you said, if they move Pete Alonso, yeah, like and that's never an easy thing because that's always in the back of your head and you're constantly thinking about that all the time. So if the Mets do move Alonso, it would be interesting to see both of them play. I do like Mark Vientos a lot. On the fantasy side of things, he was an interesting prospect when he came up last year. You don't often find guys with that type of power that come up and are like, I mean, nobody drafted Mark Vientos last year, but he was readily available in fantasy baseball. You don't find that kind of power. And he flashed it at times. And then this year, he's really flashing it. And he's actually cut his strikeout rate down to just 16%, which you love to see. One of the biggest things I look for when I'm evaluating players is, are they making better contact? Are they swinging at less pitches? And are they making quality contact? And he's actually doing all of those things. So Mark Vientos becomes an interesting one. And I do agree that he's not your prototypical third baseman. He's not going to go out there and he's not full of web gems. But yeah, get Baty some work and then see where it goes. You mentioned top Mets pitching prospects. So there's a pretty hot one that I do have to ask you about. That would be Christian Scott. He was the talk of the town there for a little bit. He's been good. Objectively, he's been good, I think, since he's been called up. I think maybe the strikeout numbers are a little underwhelming compared to the crazy numbers he was putting up in the minors. From your standpoint, like what kind of ceiling do you think a Christian Scott has? And has he kind of lived up to the expectations that Mets fans may have had for him when he initially got called up?
Yeah, he's an interesting case because he's kind of a product of the new development wave in the Mets system. I mean, the guy, his secondary pitch is a pitch he developed this year. He throws both a slider and a sweeper. And I think you mentioned the low strikeout numbers. I think his last start, he was through 4 shutout innings, didn't have a strikeout, came up in the 5th inning, struck out the side. And that's kind of just the way it goes with young pitchers sometimes. The interesting thing about expectations with Scott is that they're kind of, I don't want to say there was no expectations for him this year, but I definitely didn't think that he'd be up in May pitching for the Mets early on in the season and, producing as one of the best pitchers in the rotation. And that's just kind of how things have gone. There's been huge advancements for a lot of big name Mets pitching prospects, and Scott is at the forefront of it as the first guy to really make the big leagues and make an impact on the team. So for him, it's kind of, he's in, I think, a good situation compared to a lot of the other Mets that I think are putting pressure on themselves to perform, because with him, it's just about getting his feet under him. He's with any young pitcher like Jose Butto, who went back down to AAA, they don't know how long they're going to be here. So I think, you go up there and you put forth your best performance, and the Mets, the depth might not be great, but they do have a lot of depth at starting pitching. They have options. If Scott falters, there's no reason why he can't go back down to AAA and find himself again. But when he's on, he's looked very, very good. He's looked like the best guy out of this rotation outside of maybe Luis Severino. So for him, it's just, try pitching deep into games, make sure his pitch count stays up, and, build that endurance and get reps, man. I think an adage that my coworker Jake uses a lot is you don't really know what a pitcher's like until he goes through the league a second time. And right now, Scott's going through the first time, and it's going well. I'm curious to see what it's like down the line when he's 15, 20 starts into his career and he starts seeing offenses again. Like when he sees the Braves for the second time, what is that outing going to be like? The first outing was good. That's a terrific lineup. They can learn a lot from seeing you one time over. That's going to, I think, be either the growing pain or the signal that, Christian Scott could be something special for the Mets.
I'm hoping he's something special because he is really fun to watch. He has really good command, especially for somebody his age. And that's something that's not very, you could teach a guy to throw really fast. You could teach a guy to throw a new pitch, but to teach a guy to have that level of command is really hard to do. And so for him to already have that and to be able to build off of that, he can become somebody like a Tariq Skubal or like a George Kirby, guys that have this elite command with power stuff to go with it. And it's almost like you're reading my notes that I didn't fully send you, but I was going to ask you about Jose Butto. I was going to ask you about Jose Butto. You keep like segueing me into each section. This is perfect. Jose Butto he had a productive run this season. I mean, 1-3. I'm not gonna count the record. But 3.08 ERA, 9K per nine. Like he was a productive pitcher for the Mets this year. I think he surprised some people by being sent down. Do you think? Well, do you think the Mets are going to call him back up at some point? I feel like that's probably an easy yes. But do you think it's going to be sooner, or do you think it's probably going to be later?
Oh, that's an interesting question because they have David Peterson coming back, who's going to take Hauser's spot in the rotation, which does make five, and then who knows when Senga returns from his long rehab. So unless there are trades to be made, which I think there are, there's not really room for Butto right now. And I think the biggest thing with him is that he looked great in a lot of outings, specifically his outing against the Royals, where he got the ball pretty short notice through, I think, 6 or 7 innings of one-hit ball and basically outdueled Cole Reagans. And that was sort of his arrival. The biggest thing for him is walks, and I think that's the thing that's been plaguing this entire staff. A 5.0 walk per nine, even if your ERA and WHIP are good and you're commanding, the strike zone in certain areas and stuff like that, and you have good secondaries, it's not going to matter when you have innings like he did in his last outing before he got sent down, where it was walk, hit by pitch, wild pitch. Like that's at the major league level, you can't live like that, knowing that at some point in the start you're going to have a blow up inning. So I think his problem is good because he's not getting beat. It's not a matter of stuff or anything like that. It's just control. And I think control is something you can work on and get better at, especially when you're only 26 years old. Not everyone is going to be like Christian Scott, where they can come up and immediately assume control of the strike zone in the way that he has. So for Butto, I think he does have a bright future. I think that he's another one that was not on anybody's radar before this new development wave that has come in and has since transformed himself as a pitcher, which is very, very cool to see. I just think he needs a little bit of seasoning. I think the Mets made the right call because I don't think you want that trial by fire to happen at the major league level. I think if you have the depth to be able to put him back down and let him learn and get his licks in, then why not do it? But I wouldn't be shocked if he's back up in June.
Okay, June's a nice timeline. It's I mean, it's like a week away, but probably later June, maybe.
Late June.
Okay. And then again, you mentioned somebody else I was going to segue into. I wanted to ask you about Senga. I don't see enough people talking about Senga, at least in the fantasy baseball world or on this side of the country. Obviously, he lit the world on fire last year. That ghost fork is a crazy pitch. I think it was the most whiffed pitch in baseball last year, which is pretty impressive. And then the nasty shoulder injury, which not very many people saw coming. I know they just said he threw a nasty bullpen session against Live ABs, however long ago that was. Do you think Senga can be as effective when he comes back this year, or do you think that shoulder is going to be a real issue that hinders that even when he does come back?
Yeah, it's tough to say. I think some teams that were in on Senga kind of knew the implication of signing him, and that was the fact that he doesn't have a lot of full seasons. Like when he has pitched full seasons, they've been terrific. Last year, he threw 166 innings. He had an ERA below 3. He struck out over 200 guys. I think the season went about as well as anybody could have expected it to when he was slotted into being number 3 and ended up the ace of the team in his first start of the year. With Senga, they're not going to rush him though, because I think if he comes back prematurely and gets hurt again, it becomes a larger issue. And the Mets are already tied up in what a lot of people consider to be some bad contracts. The Senga one has to pan out in the way that they see favorably. One thing I want to touch on that I think a lot of people haven't touched on is the fact that I believe there's some sort of vesting option in his contract in terms of innings. He has an opt-out available in 2025 if he pitches 400 innings with the team. But that being said, he might only make 10 starts this year if we're lucky, and that would come out to about 60 extra innings, which would mean he would need a full season in 2025 to enable that opt-out if he did want to go on the market and seek more money, which, he's making $15 million a year, which is a lot of money, but starting pitchers get paid a ton. This is an avenue that Senga could go down towards. So I think it's partly Mets caution and partly, if we see a lot of potential in Senga, there's no real reason to rush him back and sort of enable this opt-out. And I'm sure David Stearns, who didn't sign this contract with Senga, it has that in the back of his mind as a possible asset going forward. Because going into the season, this was a rotation kind of built from scratch. and it's showing its ugliness early on in the season. But Senga, obviously not part of that. He was terrific last year.
I love Senga. I didn't know about that. The opt out in his contract. That's very interesting, especially with the limited amount of starts he will make this year. That's a good point. And then one more thing I want to ask you before I run this quick little ad. Got asked in the chat, is Tylor Megill a fantasy asset? I'm going to run that by you. Do you think he can be effective enough to be a fantasy asset?
Yeah, I mean, every year I let Tylor Megill fool me. Every year I fall for the same old tricks because all the specs are there, man. He's got the long extension. His velo is up towards 98. Like the guy has big league caliber stuff, and he just had a terrific set of rehab starts where he absolutely dominated AAA pitching. I'm just worried that he's going to be a quadruple A kind of guy where he dominates AAA and can't really catch up to major league pitching. And right now, there's not a spot for him either. Like the Mets tried him in a relief role a while ago. He had a start against Cleveland, which I think went well. The biggest key for him is that splitter that he developed from Kodai Senga. If that becomes a true weapon for him, which in his start against Cleveland, it generated a lot of whiffs and it was kind of one of his go-to secondary pitches, that changes his outlook. It takes him from the guy we've seen flounder these past couple of years into something else entirely. And if the Mets are going to be bad this year, he's going to get opportunities to pitch. They'll probably need him to pitch down the line if trades are to be made. So in terms of the fantasy aspect of things, I would hold on to him, especially if your league is kind of deep and you might be strapped for pitching at some point. Megill's going to get his run. And I think this first start against Cleveland, which is, a good team this year, is a nice glimpse into what could be for him.
I love that you pointed out the splitter because that's kind of been all the rage between last year and this year in baseball. And there are some lesser known guys that have really added it to their repertoire this year that have become very effective. Cal Quantrill is like the prime example of that for me. Cal Quantrill added the splitter and he went from he plays in Colorado, this is going to go horribly, to now I think he's like third or fourth in baseball in quality starts, which is nuts.
Doing it for the Rockies, man.
You would never see that coming from a guy like Cal Quantrill. So the splitter can be an incredibly effective pitch, and if he really has added that and can utilize that to the max, Megill becomes very interesting for me.
For sure.
All right, for those of you that are in the live, I'm going to run this for y'all real quick. Be right back. Make sure you guys do use that code FAKEBASEBALL over at Underdog Fantasy for the 50% deposit match up to your first $500 deposit. Everybody loves a free $250 in betting. Now, I want to ask you about Jomboy Media. It is arguably the biggest baseball media company there is out there, and it looks like maybe the funnest place in the world to work. So how in the world did you get started at Jomboy Media?
A little bit of right place, right time. I've talked about this a lot, but for anyone who's looking for opportunities, the best thing you can do is start making content on your own, doing it independently, and learning all the skills so that you can go out and potentially find that opportunity. And I took advantage of quarantine in 2020 to kind of abandon what I was studying in college and try and take up this skill set of video editing and researching and writing. And luckily, I lived in the Northeast area. They were growing at the same time as me. They needed a personality to hire and feature in content. And we met up, and it was kind of an instant click. And since then, it's been 3 years, which has flown by, really. And it's really, really cool to see how far we've come together.
That's awesome. Right place, right time is always the best thing. I don't work for Jomboy Media, but on a lesser scale, the same kind of thing happened for me. I was working for a place doing my writing. I went to college for writing, and then I just decided that it wasn't fruitful enough for me, so I branched out, did my own thing, and now I've made it to. I'm at Fantasy Bros. I'm at Pitcher List. I'm at my fair share of places, and so I try and tell people the same thing. The first thing to do is just get started. You don't need to have your own, or you don't need to have somebody else to help you get started. You can just do it on your own. I wrote for my own website for freaking 7 years, doing it by myself. So over at Jomboy, you do have the Shea Station podcast. I was listening to it earlier. It is a great podcast. How long have you been doing the Shea Station podcast for so far?
Since I started working at Jomboy, there's been ebbs and flows. We went away for a little bit last year, but that was the first thing I did, the Mets podcast over there for them. Being able to form a relationship with Jerry Blevins has been awesome. And now I've diversified myself a little bit. We do a lot of trivia content over on Jay and Baseball. I pop up as a guest on multiple shows. But Shea was the first thing. It's my love, and unfortunately, it's a lot more fun when the Mets are good, and it's a very tough thing to do when they're not good. And I think that's going to be a nice growing and learning experience this year. Going to have to cover a lot of bad baseball.
Bad baseball can also sometimes be easier to cover because you've always got something to talk about, even though it's not always the funnest thing to talk about. It gives you something.
Is interesting. They really are.
Yeah, and I have to commend you for that last episode when Jerry's voice was out and you kind of carried the last part of that. I've done a solo podcast episode before, and it's not an easy thing to do. You always have that moment where you're like, does anybody care that I've been rambling for like 25 minutes to myself into a computer right now? How do I
mostly just get a cotton mouth from talking so much. It breaks to drink my water.
Yeah. It's always bad when you forget to bring your water. And then you have I get these crazy dry mouth spells all the time when I'm on here with Dylan, and I have to mute my mic and let him nervously his way through me dying on the other end of the computer. You also have your YouTube channel, Jolly Olive. Make sure everybody goes and checks that out. You just put out the history of the Miami Marlins trades. How long does it take you to make something like that? Because you put it into 2 parts, didn't you?
Yes. We're on a week-to-week upload schedule. Otherwise, I probably would have put that into one longer video. But it's about that week-long routine. Like I think the most helpful thing you can do is settle into a routine and then figure out what day of the week you're supposed to be doing what. That's really helped me with my process. That's what I was doing today. Monday is writing day. Get 5 pages down to the best of your ability. Do all your research, collect all that. Tuesday is recording day and corralling all the footage. Wednesday is cutting up the video, cutting up the audio, and making sure everything's labeled up. And then, the next 2 days are all about editing and stuff like that. And it's become kind of a ritual at this point, just, something I go through the motions of. But when I first started, and like when anybody first starts, it's all kind of jagged and messy, and you're just kind of trying to do anything you find interesting, and you're constantly picking up projects and putting down projects based on what's interesting to you that day. But with the Marlins trade history, it was fun because those videos are just deep dives into the past, and you kind of get to follow one fluid timeline and see who ended up where and why they did and what people were thinking when they made those trades. It's a lot of fun, especially with a team like the Marlins.
The Marlins is a really interesting team. They've had a lot of really good players over the years. Mike Lowell is always one of my go-to guys on Immaculate Grid because he's very underutilized. He was so good.
That's one of their best trades too. They did well there.
That I loved that one. Yeah. And then the last thing I want to talk to you about, I see the videos everywhere. I think everybody probably sees the videos everywhere. The warehouse games, playing blitzball, what was the last one you guys played? Was it handball? Is that what you guys
played?
Started
slap
doing?
Ball, which is
slap
a game,
ball.
I think the first game we invented. We've taken a lot of influence from outside other sports playing content, but slap ball was all us, and it was a lot of fun. But it's definitely rigorous, man. It's a lot of running.
I guess the question for me would be, how often do you guys play that? Do you guys lay out an actual schedule, like an NFL style schedule, like you guys are going to play you guys and then we record on this day and all of that every week along with everything else? Or
it's very organized, and that's really the only reason why it's become as successful as it is, because you have to have that foundation in place of So basically, I can tell you this: the entire calendar 2024 warehouse shoots were planned out last year, and like they've been
Wow.
set in stone. They send us messages like, "Hey, we need you on these dates. Like these were the major tournaments, all this kind of stuff." And it's cool because it makes you feel like you're really part of a league, and that you
Yeah.
have to take it seriously. And I definitely feel that sometimes when I either perform and I get really invested, and sometimes when you get invested, you don't look the best on camera, or when you flounder like I did in slap ball. My team didn't play well, and it's hard not to get super into it, but and then also still remember that it's just funny content for fans. But yeah, the warehouse is very cool. To see it become what it has is I never would have expected it. But now it's full go, and I'm all about it. And I got to take it as seriously as I can because I'm a pro athlete now, apparently.
Yeah, I mean, it's on camera, and you guys have announcers and everything, so I think that's
Yeah.
all the
I
criteria
mean,
you
if
have to
Chris
meet.
Rose is calling the game, I'm taking it seriously.
Yeah. Do you practice outside of that, or do you just kind of show up and like this is just what it's going to be today?
No, good on Jimmy for basically implementing training days into the schedule as well. So basically, we'll have a test day where we make sure all the equipment is set up and ready to shoot, and we have all our angles down, and we know where to stand and all that stuff. Then we practice essentially for that day and a day the next week, learning the rules of the game, making sure it looks good on camera. A lot of the times when we come out and we're learning a game, the content comes out sloppy, and that's something that can't happen because even though it's all real and authentic, you want it to still be a fun watch. And then for 2 weeks, it's shooting the content and getting it all in front of the camera and stuff like that. So I think what a lot of people don't realize is that a lot of these events are shot far in advance. Like we're releasing the Ball and Play League right now, which is essentially the baseball cricket hybrid game that we
Ooh.
made, and that was filmed in January. So that's 4 months of editing time and post production that goes into that. It just shows you how many people are on deck and how invested everyone is in making sure this content is high quality.
That's really impressive, and you guys do a great job of making it very high quality. It's very fun to watch. It makes you
Appreciate it.
feel like you're actually watching like a professional sports game. And then I want to also ask you. So I've talked with Dalton before. He was supposed to come on the podcast at one point. We couldn't like link our schedules up. So was he as good at slap ball as the videos made it seem like he was, or was it just some clever editing?
He's a natural athlete. He really is. I don't understand. He's just got that weird lengthy build where it kind of just works for everything we do in there. No, he was a monster. I mean, it's weird because we're doing the captains league. I'm one of the captains, and we have to draft our friends, which is a really weird experience. But ahead of time, we kind of try and do like a little bit of mock drafting based on what we see, and you could tell right away that Dalton had every facet of the game down. He could throw harder than anybody. He was tall and wide enough to play defense on anybody, and he could also get down in the paint and slap it whenever he wanted. So he was just an easy shoe-in for the top pick. And as you saw from the league, the top pick was the most valuable pick.
Dude, he was dominant. Like he literally was.
It's
like
the year of Dalton in the warehouse. He hasn't lost yet.
And we love to see it too. We love to see it. I'm gonna have to hit him back up to have him come on here. See if we can link our schedules up a little better this time.
Yeah, I'll haggle him.
I appreciate you. But Jolly, thank you for coming on. Why don't you let the people know where they can find all of your work?
Yeah, I'm Jolly Olive on YouTube. That's probably the first place you'll find me. That's where it all started. If you are a Mets fan, sorry, but if you want to listen to fellow Mets fans, you can tune into the Shea Station podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube. If you just want to talk baseball, I'm Jolly Olive on Twitter and Instagram as well. Thank you for having me, Blake. It was a great time.
Yeah, I appreciate you coming on. Jolly is an excellent follow on socials. I follow myself, and I appreciate you saying yes. This is big for me. You are one of the people. I kind of got like a small list of people that I really love to have on. And when you agreed to come on, it was one of those moments. It's like, I can't believe you actually said yes.
Well, you got someone else special later this week, right?
Tomorrow, as a matter of fact. Friend of Jomboy Media. Friend of Jomboy Media was just there in that picture with you last week. We'll be on tomorrow as well. So that one will be a lot of fun. I got to put together a little show plan for that. I got to figure out what I'm going to talk to him about. But yeah, I appreciate you coming. This is big. I didn't think you were going to say yes. And so when you said yes, I was like, oh my God, like this is going to be this is going to be awesome. So yeah, I'd love to have
Appreciate
you
it,
back on at some point. Maybe after you guys trade us, Pete Alonso, you can come
Yeah,
tell
I'm
me
sure we'll
how
have
good he
lots to
is.
talk about at the trade deadline. I'm sure.
Yes. So you guys make sure you go follow Jolly. Make sure you follow us on all of our socials. It is at Fake Baseball Pod everywhere, and then at Fake Baseball on Twitter. You can follow me on Twitter at Balake with 2 H's. Subscribe to the YouTube. Follow us on all the socials. 5-star rating and reviews help us a ton. And I will catch y'all tomorrow.